All right, hello everyone. How is everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel, and this is an educational channel. We take a look at great theories of everything, ancient and modern, try to size them up and figure out how to use them. And today is our 553rd video that we've done on the reciprocal system of theory from one Dewey Bernard Larson. Mr. Larson was an American engineer, and he ended up writing books on many different subjects: chemistry and physics and astronomy, astrophysics, metaphysics, including religion, philosophy, psychology, biology. Some of his associates have written articles on meteorology, geology, cryptoarchaeology, and Mr. Larson also has 2 books on economics. We're looking at one of those books today called The Road to Permanent Prosperity. And all of these books that I'm just alluded to are all based on the same theory. So he has one theory, and he plugs it into every subject. And the theory is basically laid out in his first fundamental postulate, which states that the universe is composed entirely of one component: motion, existing in 3 dimensions, in discrete units, and with 2 reciprocal aspects, space and time. Okay, so Mr. Larson's universe is a universe made out of motion, not matter, not energy, but motion. And for Larson, motion was the relationship between space and time that sets up a generalized reciprocal relationship between space and time. All of our scientific quantities, such as matter and energy and force and pressure, they are all merely fractions, with space or time as the numerator and time or space as the denominator. They're all forms of motion, and all forms of motion are fractions, with space or time as numerator, time or space as the denominator. Space or time can have multiple exponents. And motion in Larson's universe was a kind of a more generic kind of motion that has no specific direction. Larson calls this scalar motion. You can envision a scalar motion with a balloon that you put dots on with a magic marker. If you blow up the balloon, all the dots will be moving away from each other. Every dot will be moving away from every other dot, meaning that every dot will be moving in every direction. You can't pin it down to just a specific direction. It's really just either in or out. In if you are contracting the balloon, out if you are expanding the balloon. That outward motion, Larson refers to that as the progression, and that is the source of all the motion, and that is an omnipresent, eternal motion. There is always, in every place on the universe, there is always this progression. It's always occurring. And by reversing the progression, one can get to that, really has to be reversed in or rotated or altered in some way in order to get from that outward motion to the inward motion, which Larson refers to as gravitation. So manifestation occurs by reversing that omnipresent progression and harnessing that source of motion. Now, when Larson applies this to economics, he uses again the idea of motion. So this is an economic system in motion. It focuses on things like rates of flow and also he uses, breaks it down to its bare bones or its most fundamental principles, and those are really work or starve. And he breaks it down to what he calls the Robinson Crusoe approach, where you have one person on a deserted island and looks at the economics of that and gradually complexifies the situation with barter, money, and then employees. And he finds that the two reciprocal aspects in the economic system are production and consumption. So we're in the middle right now of chapter 14. That's called Business Cycles. And I'm going to back up about a paragraph here, and we're going to start reading from chapter 14 of The Road to Permanent Prosperity, Business Cycles. The results of this present study show that the government does indeed have plenty of effective tools for controlling the business cycle. But the study also shows that many of the measures which currently occupy prominent places in the proposed control programs will have no effect on the cycle when the emergency arrives and they are put into operation. Even worse, some of these measures will actually have the opposite of the desired effect and will impede recovery from a depression rather than facilitate it. Under the circumstances, it will be nothing short of a miracle if the net effect of government action is sufficient to halt a major depression when some event comparable to the 1929 stock market crash turns the natural downward swing of the cycle into an economic catastrophe. One of the important factors in this situation is that massive movements such as Great Depressions require massive remedies. Whatever action is taken has to be sufficiently powerful to reverse or at least halt the downward trend. Merely slowing the decline does no good. It may even be harmful in that it tends to lengthen the depression period. But when no one knows whether the proposed remedies will work or not, neither the government nor the general public is likely to have enough confidence in any particular remedy to permit applying it on the necessary massive scale. In all probability, the actual procedure will be to try a little of this and a little of that, just as was done in the 1930 Depression, and the same failure to achieve satisfactory results is practically inevitable. The economy in its present condition could be compared to a vehicle which has a full set of controls, but with no identification of the devices for operating those controls, and no outside view, so that there are no means of determining whether it is on the right course, other than the shocks that are felt when rough ground is encountered, and no way of knowing just which controls should be operated to produce a specified action. If some action seems to be required, in such a situation, the obvious needs are to provide a window, some means to enable seeing where the vehicle is and where it is headed, and to determine the effects that are produced by each of the control devices, so that actions can be taken of exactly the right kind to keep the vehicle on the desired course. In the preceding chapters of this work, we have produced the equivalent of a window and have identified the controls of the economic mechanism. We have shown that the requirement for maintaining a stable economy is to keep the flow of money purchasing power entering the goods market equal to that leaving the production market. And we have further shown that the method by which this can be accomplished, the only method that will produce the desired result, is to maintain a balance between the total inflow into and the total outflow from the reservoirs of money and credit that exist in connection with the purchasing power stream. The control must be related to the total reservoir transactions. Any attempt to base a control procedure on only one factor, investment, money supply, or whatever it may be, is automatically doomed to failure, as the measures undertaken in carrying out such a control policy will not have the correct magnitude, nor will they necessarily have the right direction. If the factor being controlled is moving contrary to the movement of the net total of the reservoir transactions, which can easily happen, the control measures will be harmful rather than helpful. It is quite evident that the business cycle is simply a money inflation, as defined in Chapter 12, followed by a corresponding deflation. All that was said in Chapter 12 with respect to money inflation, its causes, and its remedies is applicable to the alternate inflations and deflations that we call the business cycle. It would be satisfying to discover, this is a quote, it would be satisfying to discover a general cause of economic fluctuations, a single source of the uneven heartbeat of the economy, says Lloyd Reynolds. Well, here it is. The movement of money into and out of the reservoirs is that single source, that general cause of economic fluctuations. In view of the rather elementary nature of the explanation developed in this study, it seems almost incredible that the economic profession should have experienced so much difficulty in analyzing the cycle and its causes. The presence of reservoirs in connection with the money purchasing power stream is obvious to anyone who looks carefully at the economic process, and it is equally clear that the mere existence of uncontrolled reservoirs of this kind must inevitably lead to economic fluctuations. It is only natural, however, that the explanation developed herein should suffer from its very simplicity. There will be a tendency to feel that the answer to a long-standing problem of this kind cannot be so simple and obvious. For this reason, it appears advisable to go into more detail concerning the mechanism of the cycle, so that there may be no question but that the reservoir theory furnishes an explanation that agrees with actual experience, even down to the smallest particular. There are two main things to be explained, according to Reynolds. First, after the economy has started moving up or down, why does it build up momentum and keep going in the same direction for a considerable period of time? Second, and more difficult, why does the movement reverse itself after a while? Why doesn't the expansion continue indefinitely? Once the action of the reservoirs is clearly understood, the answers to both of these questions are practically self-evident. Let us begin our consideration of the cycle at a point where the system is in equilibrium, where the net reservoir transactions are momentarily at zero, and market price is therefore equal to production price. While such a condition of equilibrium could theoretically occur at any volume of production, in actual practice, as matters now stand, it will coincide with a production somewhat below the maximum. Such a balanced condition, however, does not persist for any extended period in the absence of a specific program for maintaining the balance. Soon, some change takes place in the reservoir levels, either in one direction or the other. Let us assume, for the purposes of the analysis, that in this particular case, credit transactions increase, and the active money purchasing power stream is swelled by withdrawals from the reservoirs. This raises the market price level. The addition to the money flow passes on to the producers and goes partly to increasing volume and partly to increasing production price, in accordance with the principles developed in Chapter 11. The larger volumes of goods and money purchasing power flow back to the markets, and if the reservoir withdrawals have ceased, equilibrium between production and the markets is reestablished at these higher levels of production and prices. At this stage, human reactions enter the picture. The rise in employment and production has improved general economic conditions for both producers and worker consumers. While the latter, in their capacity as consumers, have to pay somewhat higher prices, this is more than offset by the fact that in their capacity as workers, they have the benefit of a favorable employment situation. The producers find a good demand for their products, and as long as the reservoir withdrawals continue, their profit margins are above normal. Confidence then prevails, and the ensuing actions of both consumers and producers with respect to the controllable features of the economy are influenced by this spirit of confidence. Here is the first place in the entire study where it has been necessary to give any consideration to human behavior. Thus far, the analysis has been confined to developing principles which take the form of statements that if certain economic actions are taken, then certain results will follow. At this point, we find it useful to extend the scope of these principles by taking note of the fact that mass reactions of human beings to certain stimuli are just as amenable to exact mathematical and logical treatment as purely physical relations. We can state with the same degree of certainty that if certain conditions prevail, then certain mass actions by human beings will result. Of course, we have been told that human actions are too unpredictable for mathematical treatment, but when we examine the situation closely, we find that the difference between individual economic actions and individual physical actions is not so great after all. It is true that the individual human beings who constitute the fundamental economic units have a certain field in which they can exercise the privilege of choice between various possible economic actions, and that this choice is individually unpredictable. But the actions of the ultimate units of the physical world are also unpredictable, de facto, if not de jure. We cannot predict the actions of an individual molecule any more than those of an individual person. Indeed, there is much support for a principle of indeterminacy, which holds that there is an inherent uncertainty about physical phenomena that is impossible to resolve. But that which is only a probability so far as an individual is concerned becomes almost a certainty for a group of individuals. And this is equally as true in human activities as it is in the physical realm. We cannot predict the lifespan of an individual by any of the means at our command, but from our actuarial tables, we can forecast with considerable accuracy the number of individuals out of any sizable group that will die within a specified period. In the economic world, as well as in the physical world, individual uncertainty can be converted into group certainty through the application of the probability principles. The conclusions which we reach concerning the mass actions of unpredictable human beings can be just as exact as the conclusions that we reach concerning the mass actions of individually unpredictable molecules, providing that we use equally accurate methods in arriving at those conclusions. When we find from observation and statistical analysis that a rising price level, together with the secondary effects that accompany this rise, induces a spirit of confidence that results in reservoir withdrawals, this does not mean that every individual will react in this manner. It means that the net reaction of all individuals in the economy will be as indicated. Let us now look at each of the important reservoirs to see how they are individually affected by the optimistic attitude. The principal contributor to the unbalancing of the system is credit. In no other way can the flow of purchasing power to the markets be more heavily augmented or more drastically reduced, and nowhere does the effect of confidence or lack of confidence show up more quickly. When business is on the upswing, both the demand for and the supply of credit are above normal, and the money purchasing power stream is swelled by heavy withdrawals from the credit reservoirs. Hand in hand with credit goes the rise in the valuation of existing assets. There is a popular misconception that this reduces the flow of consumer purchasing power to the markets, that much of the available purchasing power is used during boom times to raise the prices of land, stocks, and bonds, or other capital assets in the possession of individuals. This is not correct. These assets are purchasing power in themselves, and exchanging them for circulating purchasing power only changes the ownership of the two forms of purchasing power at the same economic location. Every exchange of money for other assets by one consumer is also an exchange of these other assets for money by some other consumer, and consequently there is just as much money and just as large amount of the other assets in the hands of consumers in general after an exchange of this kind as there was before the exchange, regardless of the price at which the sale was consummated. A higher price increases the amount of money transferred, but it does not alter the final result, as transfer of money between consumers has no effect on the total amount of money in the possession of consumers in general, and hence no effect on the availability of money purchasing power for buying currently produced goods. This is principle 4. Increases in the prices of existing goods in the hands of consumers finance themselves. Expressing this in another way, we have principle 13, which states that all consumer purchasing power must be used for the purchase of goods from producers. It cannot be used for the purchase of goods already in the hands of consumers, or for raising the prices of such goods. This point is worth emphasizing, as a misunderstanding of the facts with respect to transactions involving existing capital assets is responsible for much fallacious reasoning in current economic literature. It is another of those items which the orthodox approach to economic relations fails to clarify, and it is therefore not surprising that the work of many analysts has been seriously affected by this error. For example, the economists of the Brookings Institution carried out some detailed studies of the effect of distribution of income on the general economic situation, in the course of which they concluded that when the current volume of savings exceeds the requirements for new capital construction, the excess is taken up in various ways, including the purchase of existing securities or bidding up the prices of these securities. As one of these investigators puts it, quote, "What became of the accumulated purchasing power that was not absorbed by higher prices? Much of it was used as time passed in buying additional quantities of consumer goods as they became available in the market. Some of it was used for the construction and improvement of homes. Some of it went for the purchase of urban or farm real estate. Some of it went to liquidate mortgages or to buy insurance policies, to increase savings deposits, and to purchase securities in the market." End quote. The present analysis shows that most of those transactions do not absorb any of the accumulated purchasing power. This excess money purchasing power cannot be used for buying additional quantities of consumer goods, because the production of those goods creates all of the purchasing power that is needed for their purchase at the existing market price level. They cannot be used for the construction and improvement of homes for the same reason. These home improvements are merely consumer goods of another sort. They cannot be used for the purchase of urban or farm real estate. As such, purchases are transactions at the same economic location. The amount of purchasing power available for consumer use is not altered by such transactions, regardless of the prices at which the sales are made. Purchase of insurance policies is equivalent to consumption, except to the extent that the equities of the policyholders or stockholders are increased. Money purchasing power can be withdrawn from the stream going to the markets by storing the money or by retiring currency. But unless it is thus withdrawn, the entire amount is used for the purchase of goods currently put on the market by producers. Thus far in these discussions, only the interactions in a self-contained unit are being considered. Foreign trade, to be considered later, may cause some modification of the market situation, but these changes are separate and distinct from the phenomena with which we are now concerned and can be added later. Bidding up prices of securities and real estate is often cited as one of the ways in which excess money purchasing power is absorbed during the boom phase of the business cycle, particularly by those who deplore the diversion of funds from more productive uses. But this is another misconception. As noted earlier in the present chapter, these speculative price increases finance themselves. The amount of money purchasing power available for consumer use is not altered in any respect by these transactions, regardless of the prices at which the sales were made. However, the reevaluation of assets generates further credit transactions that do affect the money reservoirs. The use of credit is normally limited by the amount of acceptable security available to the prospective borrowers. Under present banking policies, when market prices rise, a larger amount of credit will be extended on the same security. The purely imaginary additional values resulting from speculative transactions thus have the effect of temporarily enlarging the credit reservoir. Consequently, they increase the active money purchasing power rather than absorbing it. During periods of increasing business activity, there is also more than the usual amount of creation of claims against the future, patents, monopoly privileges, etc. Money purchasing power obtained by means of credit based on the present value of such claims helps extend the economic unbalance. In addition to the money reservoirs, there are also reservoirs of goods. Those goods in the hands of consumers can be ignored for present purposes, as they have no effect on the general economic situation regardless of what disposition is made of them. From that prior principle 13. Goods in producers' stocks do play a part in the market process. There is always a certain quantity of finished and partly finished goods in the possession of the producers or in transit, but during those periods when prices are rising and buyers are plentiful, the stocks of goods drop because of the unbalanced pressure on the buying side. This additional volume of goods flowing to the markets from storage contributes to some degree toward holding prices down, and consequently, it is a stabilizing factor during the rising phase of the cycle, but unfortunately only a minor one from the overall standpoint. The producers may also have reserves in the form of capital assets that are readily marketable, but neither the accumulation nor the utilization of such reserves influences the price structure or the business cycle in any way. These capital assets must be bought in order to accumulate them and sold in order to utilize their purchasing power. In the purchase and sale, the markets are affected to the same extent as if the money had been paid out in dividends and the purchasing power had been used by the individual recipients. When business is good, the opportunities for profitable use of money are relatively plentiful, and the reasons for holding it in reserve are minimized. As a consequence, money flows out of storage during the business upswings. Under the influence of the augmented money stream, market prices rise still more, and this in turn adds to the psychological forces inducing further withdrawals from the reservoirs. Here, then, is the first of the explanations that Reynolds called for in the statement quoted earlier. In its early stages, the business boom is a self-reinforcing process. But the withdrawals from the reservoirs cannot continue indefinitely because there are finite limits in each case, which is the reason for using the term reservoir in application to the various sources of inflationary additions to the money purchasing power stream. Obviously, money cannot be withdrawn from storage in excess of the amount stored. And when the money reservoir nears the empty point, the outward flow must necessarily diminish. Similarly, credit cannot continue to increase without limit. As time goes on, it becomes more and more difficult to find additional security acceptable to the lender. Even governments do not have unlimited credit. There is a normal level of each reservoir determined by the amount of borrowing that would be done and the amount of money that would be kept in reserve. If business activity were riding along without any apparent trend one way or the other, the rising prices and increasing profits in the case now being analyzed caused the growth of a split spirit of optimism regarding future prospects and induce withdrawals which lower the levels in the reservoirs below normal. But these lower levels can only be maintained by the constant application of an external force, the optimistic public attitude, and it can therefore be said that a condition of strain has been produced in the reservoirs which will tend to bring the levels back to normal whenever the external forces are no longer operative. The stronger the forces operating to drain the reservoirs, the lower the levels that will be eventually reached, and the greater the strain that will be effective toward restoring the normal conditions when external forces are removed.